Chapter 15. "So are you coming? I'll be waiting," Malou uttered as she woke up from her dream. How was that possible? I saw him, she thought as she touched her dream catcher that was still hanging around her neck. As she did so, she felt drawn back into her dream. She closed her eyes and instantly saw Dan looking at her. She was holding Stefano in her arms. Dan was standing at the foot of the bed in her hospital room, and then nothing. This time she opened her eyes and looked around her as if to see if she was still in the maternity ward or if she had returned to her bed on the boat. When she realized that she was still aboard the cruiser, she got up, slipped into her robe and made her way to the kitchen. In a daze, she sat at the table and let her eyes travel around the small room. She was sad. If only she had remembered to hold hands with Dan when they were due to return to 2013 the first time they travelled to their past together. Nothing of this would have happened. She let tears roll down her cheeks for a moment until she saw Damianos come down the stairs and sit across the table from her. "You and Dan have taken a huge step ahead in time tonight," he said quietly. Malou nodded. "I guess that's what it was when I woke up," she said, wiping the tears with the back of her hand. "This is so difficult, Damianos. I don't know how I'm going to be able to go on for 22 more years of this. Seeing Dan and being unable to touch him or even approach him is sheer torture, you know that?" She raised her gaze to the shepherd. "It is true that we will travel 22 more years before we reach our final destination, Malou, but it will not take that long in reality." Malou was pensive for a moment, and then she said, "But what about the 7 days that we were only allowed to spend in the past? What happened to that?" Damiano smiled. "They're still in play, my dear. Yet if you remember, time as we understand it as mortals is not God's time, for one thing, and for another, as you know, the earth and everything that God created in our universe, he did in 6 days and rested on the 7th day. So you shouldn't worry, you'll be back in the clearing, in time to return to 2013 as promised, Malou." "That's good to know," she said, shaking her head, a timid smile appearing on her lips. "But tell me something, Damianos. Do you know if Daniel is okay still? I mean, he was never alone like this." "That's another thing you shouldn't worry about, my dear. God will not let anything happen to him. Besides, he's not entirely alone anymore." "Oh, you've seen him again, have you?" "Not really. I mean, I don't know where he is at the moment, but I have been told he's with someone who's looking after him." "Who told you this? Did you talk to Solange or Damien?" Damiano shook his head. "No, Malou, I haven't yet. And like you, it's in my nature to watch over a child, as you know. And Daniel may be 20 years old, but he's still a child. God knows this. So he makes sure I am aware if the child in my care is okay." Malou got up from the banquet that surrounded the table and went to the small fridge. "Do you want some milk?" he asked their cat. She knew he would never refuse some milk any time, day or night. Damiano smiled and nodded. As he and Malou were sipping on their glasses of milk, Stefano, half asleep, stumbled into the kitchen and went to sit beside his mother. She smiled at him. "You were born tonight," she declared quietly. Stefano looked at her, uncomprehending. "How do you mean?" he asked, goggle-eyed. "Your mum means that she relived your birth in her dream, Stefano," Damiano said. "Oh, I see. Does that mean I'm going to be able to remember things the way they actually happen from now on, then?" "Yes, son," Damianos replied. "From now on you'll be able to see or witness the events that occurred in your life." "What about Gabby and Daniel? Will they have to be born like me before that happens for them as well?" "Yes, for Gabby at least it will be the case, because she's with us here, but for Daniel it might be a little different." "Different? How?" Malou asked. "As I said, it might be different," Damianos replied, shaking his head. "On the other hand, I'm sure you will revisit the time at which you gave birth to Daniel, Malou, but on the other, I don't know how Daniel will experience the event." "We'll just have to wait and see then, won't we?" Malou said, while sadness once again filled her heart. As Daniel came back from the kitchen, coffee cup in hand, he smiled at Billy and regained his seat beside the big guy. "Didn't you say you wanted to show me some other photos that would interest me?" he asked. "Yeah, but before I do that, why don't you tell me about your meeting with Lucido, eh?" "Well, that wasn't really a meeting, as you call it. It was just that he woke me up and began to tell me about Destiny and what her name meant." "Ah, yes. I remember him talking to me about that when I first met him." "Didn't you say that you sold her for scrap when your parents died?" "Sure did, and not even Lucido told me that she was going to be resurrected, sort of thing." Daniel drank some of his coffee. "I guess she was somehow. But what always intrigued me was that when I met the Gomez family, the ones that fished me out when I went for a swim and before I came here, Mr. Gomez said that Destiny was registered with the marina, but that she had left that morning. I still can't figure this out. If my family was aboard that cruiser when I was lost, How could it have been registered in 2006? When did you leave the boat? Billy asked. We were still in 1988 then, so I don't understand how she could be registered at 2 different times. Let me try answering that, Lucido said, appearing suddenly and standing beside Dan near the table. Well, hello there, little fellow, Billy said, chuckling. Always nice to see you. How have you been? Fine, Billy, very peachy, Lucido replied, smiling from ear to ear. But let me answer Daniel's question. He looked up at him. See, matey, the good Lord figured that you couldn't stay long with the Gomez, and he probably inscribed Destiny's name in the Marina's registry to make sure Mr. Gomez couldn't ask any more questions than he did. Are you saying Destiny was never here in Key West in 2006? Daniel asked. Yes, matey, that's what I'm saying. As I told you last night, you were not anywhere near Key West in 2006. You were only 13 years old at the time, and you had moved from Pennsylvania to Davie by then, if you remember. Daniel nodded. Yes, that's right. And then I also told you that in order for Destiny to find you, you'll need to be where you were in 2007. Yes, and that's where I've got a problem, Daniel said, switching his gaze to Billy. I've got to save enough money to take the bus and go to Davie so that my family can find me. You think I can find a cheap place around here where I could crash while I work in your shop? What about my storage room? Not good enough for you? Billy replied teasingly. I can assure you there's nothing cheaper in the neighborhood unless you want to sleep on the beach. He laughed heartily. I know, Billy, but I don't want to be in the way. What on earth do you mean, boy? You're not in the way of anything or anyone. Besides, I should think that getting you some space and maybe freshen the room a bit would do the trick. What do you say? Daniel's head bobbed up and down. If you're sure. Of course I'm sure, Daniel. I couldn't have proposed it otherwise, now would I? Okay, so that I see you are both okay, Lucido interposed. I think I'll be on my way if you don't mind. Already? Daniel asked. I thought you would stay and talk for a bit. A man, even one of my definitive side, has got a full schedule, don't you know? Okay, Billy said, patting the little guy on the back. On your way then, don't be a stranger, okay? All right, I'll be back, Lucido said before snapping his fingers and disappearing. After a moment of silence between Billy and Daniel had passed, Daniel looked down at the open album. So where are the other photos you wanted to show me? He sipped on his coffee. Oh, it's just this one photo, Billy replied, flicking the pages of the album again. Here it is. He pointed to an old sepia picture of a young couple holding hands. Their attires suggested the photograph had been taken a long time ago. Wow, Daniel exclaimed. That looks like my grandpa and grandma. He looked up at Billy. Do you know them? No, son. To this day I had no idea who these two were. I think Laura found the picture in my parents' things and she put it in. Maybe she thought I would find out who they were after she passed. Billy got up, obviously choked up. Every time he thought about Laura, he felt as if a golf ball was lodged in his throat. I guess I'll have another coffee too, he said, walking to the kitchen. Daniel couldn't understand why his grandparents' picture was in Billy's album, but he figured that his folks must have known Billy's parents. They knew so many people anyway, he thought. When Dan woke up the next morning, he could hardly wait to tell Chippewa and Gustavo what he had seen and experienced the previous night. As soon as he saw the two men sitting at their now usual table in the motel's restaurant, he rushed to them and sat down. "My, don't you look in a hurry this morning," Gustavo remarked. "What happened? Did you see a ghost?" He guffed. "Just about, Gustavo," Dan replied. He turned to Chippewa. "Good morning, how are you?" he asked. "Very well, Dan, thanks. But you seem a little perturbed. What is it?" "You could say that, yes," Dan replied, returning his gaze to Gustavo. "And it was not a ghost that I saw last night, but Malou on TV." "Really? How could that be?" Gustavo looked at Chippewa inquiringly. "Ha ha 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 ha!" The Dreammaker laughed. "I am not really sure, but technology allows us to show you, Dan, things that would be difficult for you to relive, either because it would be difficult to recreate the event or because the people concerned are travelling through time themselves. Such is the case for Malou." "But what did you see?" Gustavo asked. "Was it something that you had experienced with her?" "Oh yes, first I saw her on our wedding day. She was in this park beckoning me to come to her. She said she was waiting for me, and then I saw a few moments later I was in the maternity ward seeing her holding Stefano. She didn't say anything, but Damianos did." "Oh, was he there with you?" Gustavo asked, eyebrows raised. "No, not really. It was another of his apparitions, but when I asked him if he had found Daniel yet, he just said that all he knew was that he was somewhere between 12 and 15 years ahead of us." "And you will have to experience a few things yet before we reach the date at which he would have landed," Chippewa remarked. "But why can't we speed the process a little? All this stalling around is just killing me." "Take it easy, man," Gustavo said, patting Dan on the back. Why don't you have some breakfast and go on to the next step, eh? Daniel nodded resignedly. All in God's time, I guess.